Hey, everybody. Welcome back to Reason and Theology. Your host, Michael. On a Saturday, I want to talk about the sin of schism. I am seeing people who are still misunderstanding uh, some very important points that need to be considered in the discussion on schism, especially as it relates to people who deny that Pope Francis is the Pope. I'm not seeing enough nuance here, and that's a problem because it ends up misleading people as to what the legitimate criticism is for people who deny Pope Francis as the Pope. So that's what I want to do for the first part of this video. And then the next part, I want to talk about the supplied grace ceremonies, not in any kind of depth, but a supplied grace ceremony controversy that is going on that certainly relates to the question of schism. Okay, so let's start with schism itself. What exactly is it? Now, I want to share my screen very briefly so we can go to the Code of Canon Law to get it from the horse's mouth. There have been historically different ways in which we can define schism. Suarez, for instance, defines it differently than the Code of Canon Law, or at least more broadly than the Code of Canon Law, I should say. And I'd be happy to talk about Suarez sometime and others who put forward the thesis of whether, the Pope can be in schism. I answer no, especially with the Code of Canon Law's definition that we're operating with today. But with a broader definition that he was using, I could see how somebody would make a case for that, even though I don't think he was right. But whether we like it or not, we're operating with a more restrictive definition of what schism is today. Just as we are for heresy. The term heresy used to be a lot more broad. Well, it used to be broader than it is today. Now we're operating with a very strict, narrow definition of what heresy is. Same for schism. So you can't point to people in the past from the first millennium or even the medieval period and try to say, well, here's what heresy is over and against what the current definition is today. Likewise, whenever we're discussing the question of schism today, please don't go to Suarez and others who are using broader definitions and using the term more broadly than we do today. We have to be a little bit more precise and use the terms correctly today. Now, schism is the refusal of submission to the Supreme Pontiff. So there's a lack of submission here to the Pope, and it is obviously not going to be a submission to things of sin, right? The Pope can't require a person to sin. So if the Pope tells a person to go and murder somebody and you say, no, I'm not going to do that, that's not refusing submission to the Supreme Pontiff because there's a higher law at play there. But if the Pope is commanding something of an inferior that is not inherently evil, then a refusal of submission to the Supreme Pontiff or communion with the Supreme Pontiff would certainly be an act of schism, especially in the case of communion with the Roman Pontiff. You could make a case that a refusal to submission to the Roman Pontiff on some points would be a sin, but not necessarily an act of schism. We could make some distinctions there. But there are some cases where you could refuse to submit to the Pope, and that is schismatic. So just be aware that, there are some exceptions to some of these things here in the definition. So schism is the refusal of submission to the Supreme Pontiff or of communion with the members of the church subject to him. So it's not just I refuse to submit to the Roman Pontiff, but it's also I refuse to be in communion with those who are subject to him. That second part of the definition is often overlooked. And somebody brought up the other day, what about an instance where somebody refuses on a matter of principle to go to a Novus Ordo? I would ask, how is that consistent with the Code of Canon Law? The highest expression of communion is sacred communion and sharing in the body of Christ together. If you refuse to do that in a rite legitimately and universally promulgated by the magisterium, it's like, well, that's the highest expression of communion. If you refuse to participate in that, well, that would be saying, I refuse to share in communion with this person unless it's on my terms, unless they come to my liturgy. I don't see that as consistent with this definition. But again, so to recap, not every lack of submission to the Roman pontiff is schismatic. If the Roman pontiff said, hey, I want you to carry this letter from Bethlehem to Jerusalem, and you say, no, I'm not going to do that. Is that schism? No, no. Might there be an element of sin there? Potentially, but that's not the kind of refusal of submission that we're referring to here in this definition. The refusal of submission that we're referring to here would be in instances that relate to especially ecclesiology. Like, I refuse to be under the jurisdiction of the Pope. I want to be a bishop who is operating autonomously, or I'm a priest who wants to operate autonomously, or it would more pertain to jurisdiction, ecclesiology, things like that. Okay, so that's the definition of schism. Now, is it the case that somebody who commits an act of schism, are they automatically in mortal sin? We have to ask that question because I just saw it presented once again, a misrepresentation, saying that those who are saying that a denial of Pope Francis as the Pope is schism, well, those people are accusing those people of being in mortal sin. That's not the case. It may be an act of schism to refuse to submit to the Roman pontiff. That would include acknowledging his papacy. That may be an act of schism, but that's not the same as, is that person in mortal sin? Those are two different questions. And what I'm seeing is a shifting of the discussion from the act to the person. And that's something that we don't need to do. We need to make some distinctions here. An act can be grave matter, whereas the person's culpability in that act is something else. A person's culpability could be venial, even though it's a grave act. We know this to be true with just the very basics of Catholicism. If somebody does something that is grave matter, but they lack full knowledge or full consent of the will, it's reduced to a venial sin. It would not be considered a mortal sin. A mortal sin would have to be grave matter, full knowledge, and full consent at the time of the act. There are instances where a person could commit the act of schism and be ignorant that that's what they're doing. That would mitigate their personal culpability. They still did a schismatic act. That's not taken away. But whether or not they committed a mortal sin, that's a different question. This is why we have instances where you have saints who held to something that is actually heretical. We might think of Gregory of Nyssa and his assertion of apokatastasis. That was later on defined to be heretical. So he had a lack of knowledge that this was heresy. Was it in fact heretical? Yes. It doesn't become heresy only at the time that it's declared heresy, objectively speaking. Whether it's an error doesn't really factor in on whether or not it's declared to be an error later on. It's still always an error, right? Whether it's declared or not. But one's knowledge of that is dependent upon, hey, has this been declared to be heresy or not? Or could it be easily known that this is heresy, even without a declaration? So in the case of Gregory of Nyssa, we can say he's a saint, even though he held to something that's heretical. It's wrong. It's an error. But he would not have maintained that if he had known that the church was going to judge against this. His knowledge, he didn't have full knowledge that this was an error. And certainly his will would not have conformed to an error. So we would say that there's no culpability there. We wouldn't say that Gregory of Nyssa was in mortal sin. We can use Thomas Aquinas and his denial of the Immaculate Conception as another example. Well, if that's true of heresy, that's also true of schism. People will point out, well, there are instances, St. Vincent of Ferrer and others, who backed an anti-pope, and yet they're saints and were performing miracles. Sure, sure. Yeah. It's possible for a saint to be mistaken on who the pope is. That's not in dispute here. Um, a person could be ignorant there, especially in the time of the Western Schism. A person could be ignorant of some of the situations that were going on, especially when word didn't travel as quickly as it does today. So I could totally see somebody being ignorant of that and yet still being in the life of God, being in God's covenant, participating in his divine life, being a saint. But that doesn't mean that St. Vincent Ferrer backing an anti-pope wasn't still a schismatic act. You see the difference? One is the question of, was St. Vincent of Ferrer guilty of the sin of schism? The answer would be no. Another is the question of, was that act an act of schism? The answer is yes. In the same way, we can say, was Thomas Aquinas guilty of heresy, the sin of heresy? Of course not. Of course not. However, is the act of denying the Immaculate Conception, however, still wrong and erroneous and even heretical? Yes. So there's a confusion of categories here. You'll hear people dismiss what people like myself are saying whenever we say it is a schismatic act to deny that Pope Francis is the Pope, because you have a mistaken view of who Pope Benedict was and whether or not he was the Pope and all that. And so now you believe that Pope Francis is an anti-Pope. And so it's still a schismatic act. That's not to say, however, that there's automatically personal culpability there and one is automatically a mortal sin. I can't make those determinations on an individual. A person who denies that Pope Francis is the Pope, it's a schismatic act. That's materially schism. In the same way we would say Gregory of Nyssa, that was materially heresy, what he affirmed. But was he formally a heretic? Of course not. Therefore, as a person who's saying Pope Francis isn't the Pope, are they automatically formally a schismatic? No. They could be. That could be the case, but no, it's certainly not automatic. There's plenty of mitigating circumstances in knowledge and also the will that could be present. And so I don't think it's prudent to make any judgments on one particular individual. I'll let the church make those judgments. If the church wants to come out and say so and so is a formal schismatic, that's up to the church to do. That's great. The church is competent to decide those things. I'm not going to make a personal judgment on any particular individual who is denying that Pope Francis is the Pope. I reserve that to God. In fact, I tend to assume that they are not in mortal sin. I tend to assume that there's mitigating circumstances there. I err on the side of grace rather than, the other end, judgment. I err on the side that they have mitigating circumstances. That doesn't take away, however, from the fact that they are in a dangerous position, and I'm going to call them away from that. Thus, I'm still going to say that is schismatic. Turn away from that. In the same way that if a brother in Christ were to come to me and say, I just don't believe that the Virgin Mary was assumed into heaven. A Catholic were to come and say, I just, I can't buy into that. I'm going to say, well, I'm going to reserve judgment on whether or not there's an obstinacy there. I'm going to reserve judgment on that. I'm not going to automatically assume they're obstinate and they're in mortal sin. But I am going to say, but my friend, this is dogmatic and this is a dangerous position because this could lead to you cutting yourself off from God. You need to turn away from that. Here's what the church teaches, and here's why it teaches that. And I will try to persuade that person so that they see the reasons for believing the assumption of the Virgin Mary. Likewise, what I've tried to do is I hold judgment on individuals who are committing acts of schism today by denying Pope Francis is the Pope. I hold judgment on them personally. But what I will do is I will warn people away from that position. And I will say that is dangerous, that it could lead to severing oneself from Christ. And it leads to, unfortunately, tearing the body apart rather than uniting it. So whenever I see people dismiss that position because they want to say, well, it's not automatically a mortal sin, or you have saints who were in error about who the Pope was, I know automatically they're either misrepresenting the situation deliberately, or they are ignorant of what the situation is and what the claims are. I assume it's a matter of ignorance rather than a deliberate deception. Unless there's really, 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 really good evidence that a person is intentionally trying to deceive people, I hold off on making that judgment. I mean, it's just that's too hard to determine in most cases. It's very hard to discern whether or not somebody is intentionally misleading people. And odds are it's much more likely that they're not trying to intentionally mislead people. They just are ignorant or incompetent, one of the two. They're talking about a subject matter that they shouldn't be discussing. There's a lack of competency there, or they're ignorant of what is actually being said. Therefore, they're unintentionally misrepresenting the situation. So those are some things to keep in mind whenever you hear figures who come and try to say, oh, St. Vincent of Ferrer, therefore it's okay to question now whether Pope Francis is the Pope. That does not logically follow. Does not logically follow. Because St. Vincent Ferrer, as a saint, would have been the first to tell you, even if you have mitigating circumstances in your knowledge of who the Pope is, he's not going to say it's okay to be ignorant of who the Pope is. That's not going to be a position that he would take. And moreover, you can't compare his situation back then to today, because back then, not only was the situation incredibly different, information didn't travel as well as it does today. So there's less opportunity for people to be ignorant today, given the amount of information that is available, given how easily the truth is accessible. So it's not analogous for multiple reasons. Okay, now, what I want to do now is I want to briefly watch just a few minutes of a video that was posted on YouTube about a really interesting and sad situation involving supplied grace ceremonies. I know I've spoken about this on the show previously. That's where we're going to go next. I'm going to take a quick 2-minute break, get some more coffee. We'll meet back and we're going to review the video. In the meantime, if you haven't already, go ahead and hit that like button and the subscribe button. And if you appreciate the content that I'm providing here, you believe I'm doing good work, check me out, patreon.com/reason and theology, and please consider supporting me. All right, we're going to meet back in about 2-3 minutes here, and we will continue with the second half of the video discussing very briefly supplied grace ceremonies. Are you confused about how Catholic teaching authority works? With encyclicals, papal bulls, councils, and many other things, it's easy to get confused on what is authoritative and what is not. Fortunately, at maximusinstitute.com, I have prepared a course explaining the magisterium from A to Z. Visit the website and check out the course Understanding the Magisterium for more information.
If you're looking to buy or sell a home, office, or any kind of property anywhere in the world, you're going to want to call Real Estate for Life, and they're going to connect you with a Catholic agent. Now, that agent will donate a portion of their commission upon sale, and Real Estate for Life will donate 75% of that gift to a pro-life organization at no cost to you. Call Real Estate for Life at 1-877-LIFE-US1 or text them 248-431-1440. If you care about the pro-life cause, call them now.
And continue here. Let's share my screen. And let's watch a few minutes of this. Now, you might recall a while back, Kevin Simmons and I did a video. I'm going to put it in the show notes fact, let me try to pull it up real quick. It's on the supplied grace ceremonies issue. Share my screen, you'll see it. The name of it is Supplied Grace Ordination Ceremonies R&T highlights. You might not recall this because it was August 5th, 2021. It's almost 2 years ago. And I'm not going to go into this in any kind of extreme detail now because, in fact, I'm going to do a show in the future with Kevin Simmons on this in much more detail. But for now, for various reasons, I'm just going to briefly comment on this because of the fact that Michael Voris just brought it up in a Vortex episode, which I appreciated that he did. But I'm not going to go into details beyond what he shared just yet. More to come on that. But what exactly is this? Well, supplied grace ceremonies. These are, it's a new thing. It's a complete novelty. It's an invention. You can look at the rite of ordination in the Missal of 62 and then compare it to the rite of ordination in the post-conciliar church, and you'll see some differences. The parts that pertain to the validity of the sacrament are still the same, right? I mean, in both cases, pre and post-conciliar sacraments are still valid, right? Nothing has been substantially altered there. But there are accidental features and extra prayers and stuff like that are in the pre-conciliar rite of ordination versus the Roman rite in the post-conciliar era, where some of those prayers aren't there. And I certainly think that we can argue that, perhaps those prayers should be there. Not for validity, but it's never a bad thing to have extra prayers, right? Never a bad thing. Does it mean somehow one is deprived of grace if they have less prayers? No, that's a bad argument because, goodness, our liturgy in the Roman Rite for a very long time is much shorter than, and I'm not even talking about in the post-conciliar era, even in the pre-conciliar era, it's much shorter than many of the Eastern liturgies, which are much longer and have many, many, many more prayers. Does this somehow mean that the Eastern liturgies offer more grace than the Roman Rite? Of course not. Not at all. Not at all. I don't take that position, and I don't think anybody should. But some people do take the erroneous position that the pre-conciliar liturgies, in the pre-conciliar liturgy in the Roman Rite, offers more grace because it has more prayers. There's various views, but that's kind of one of the views. So the Roman Rite, though valid in the post-conciliar era, it's not offering as much grace as the pre-conciliar era. Again, bad argument, because if we're going to start doing that, compare the Roman Rite historically to any of the Eastern liturgies, and you're going to quickly realize the Eastern liturgies are a lot longer and have many more prayers. Does that mean the Eastern churches have more grace than the Roman Rite? Obviously, that's a bad argument. No, that doesn't work. So let's stop using the bad argument. But some people have bought into this bad argument. They haven't thought through it consistently. And they say, okay, well, if I'm ordained in the new rite of ordination, in the post-conciliar era, I might be validly ordained. Some of them might question their ordination, but for those who don't, they say, well, I might be validly ordained, but I may not have as much grace in my ministry as I would if I had gone through the old rite of ordination. But they might say, I can't repeat the sacrament by undergoing the entire rite of ordination from the pre-conciliar era. I can't repeat the sacrament because that would be a simulation of sacrament, and that would be not only a major sin, but there could be some other canonical penalties associated with that, simulating sacrament. So they say, okay, well, those things that pertain to validity, you can't repeat that part. But all those extra prayers that were in the pre-conciliar era that are left out in the post-conciliar era, maybe I should go through a ceremony with all those extra prayers, minus the actual part that just reordains me, right? Minus that part. but maybe I should go through a ceremony with all those extra prayers because that would provide me more grace, because there's a lot of extra prayers there that weren't said over me. And so I may be a valid priest, but I don't have as much grace as maybe somebody who went through that other ceremony. So they might then be tempted to do what's called a supplied grace ceremony, where you would go through, again, these are completely new and entirely innovative. This is not anything historical. And it can't be likened to perhaps some of the extra prayers that are said over a person in baptism, such as exorcism. Not analogous here for various reasons. And so they might be tempted to go through these ceremonies to get extra graces. So that's what a supplied grace ceremony is. And the error at the heart of it is to assume because there are extra prayers, that equals extra grace. That's the error. Not to mention that the supplied grace ceremony would be done without the permission of the bishop. What does Ignatius of Antioch tell you? You know, actually knew right there within living memory of the apostles, Ignatius of Antioch, early 2nd century, tells you do nothing without the consent of the bishop. So some people might be tempted to undergo some of these ceremonies clandestinely without the knowledge of their bishop, without the permission of their bishop, and to receive these ceremonies from somebody who doesn't even believe Pope Francis is the Pope or others. But at the very least, it's being done clandestinely. Again, I'm not going to share anything beyond that. I think we're going to do, Kevin Simmons and I, we're going to do a video in the future where we're going to give some more details, but we're probably going to wait until more news breaks on this. There is a lot more information that we personally both have on the matter, but we're going to hold off at the moment for various reasons. That being said, I do want to share briefly what Michael Voris shared on his Vortex. Let's briefly watch this together, because I think a lot of people overlooked this. I haven't really heard many people talking about it. All right, so here we go.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Vortex, where lies and falsehoods are trapped and exposed. I'm Michael Voris. Sometime, likely in the not too distant future, an earthquake is going to erupt in the church, and its epicenter will be the ranch of Mel Gibson in Agora Hills, California. Gibson is a well-known actor, splendid movies, wonderful acting ability. In terms of his faith, he is a sedevacantist, a word that comes from the Latin meaning empty chair, meaning the throne of St. Peter has no occupant. It's empty. There's no pope. There are different camps of sedevacantists, and while there are some divisions among them, there is broad agreement that Vatican II was bad and that there has not been a valid pope since the death of Pope Pius XII in 1958. And yeah, you heard that right. Not a valid pope in 65 years and counting.
And by the way, you know, just to add to that, there are new sedevacantists now who deny that Pope Francis is the Pope, but they don't deny the papacy of Benedict, John Paul II, John the 23rd, you know, Paul VI, stuff like that. So they wouldn't be your historical, if we can even call them that, since they didn't really come around until the 70s, but your more historical or classic sedevacantists, they wouldn't fit into that category, but they're still sedevacantists because they deny that Pope Francis is the Pope. So therefore, they do believe that the see is vacant. I heard somebody just today felt so offended that he's being called a sedevacantist, and he literally publicly takes the stance that Pope Francis isn't the Pope. He identifies as Catholic, publicly takes the stance that Pope Francis isn't the Pope, but he's offended that he's labeled a sedevacantist. Really? It kind of reminds me of people who feel like they're being misgendered when people actually identify what their gender is. It's not wrong to identify what a person actually is. If you don't believe that Pope Francis is the Pope, you believe the see is vacant. What is that called? What do you call that? That's called sedevacantism. It's not an insult. It's not meant to be offensive. It's just describing what a person is. Just in the same way that I describe what a person's gender is. It's not an insult. Just describing what they are. Oh wait. Okay, let's continue here.
And it's that and counting part that is becoming a problem for some sedes. It will come as no surprise that at least some sedevacantists do not accept bishops ordained in the Latin Church under the completely revised rites after Vatican II. This inevitably leads to a sede priest personnel crisis. They need to replenish their ranks and fast. And this is where Mel Gibson starts to get involved. A few years ago, a 97-year-old retired bishop in Texas caught the attention of.
Notice he doesn't give the name there, and that's fine. I'm not knocking Vors for not giving the name. I'm just pointing out that he doesn't mention who it is. He says retired bishop in Texas. Listen to that again.
97-year-old
97-year-old
retired bishop in Texas caught
retired bishop in Texas. I'll leave you to figure out who that is.
The attention of the sedevacantists, Gibson included, after the bishop declared, with many non-sedevacantists, that Francis was not the validly elected pope. In 2020, Gibson met with this bishop, who claims that he was consecrated in the pre-Vatican II rite of ordination.
And you remember that whole silly conclave that we just saw a few weeks ago, where I don't know, a couple random people in Rome declared Pope Francis to be the Pope. They then posted that this said bishop in Texas, who's 97 years old and retired, accepted that conclave now that Pope Francis is Pope. So just throwing that one out there.
Therefore, if he ordained a priest, that priest would fit the bill of not being a Vatican II priest and thusly be validly ordained. In January 2021, the then 97-year-old retired prelate was at Mel's Ranch. There, the bishop provided an affidavit to Gibson, sworn to January 21st, 2021, before a California notary public. Church Militant has the name and the commission number of the notary. And so that those who are concerned with this understand we do have all that information in our possession. We will reveal that the notary's commission number begins with 22-17. The affidavit maintains that he had indeed been consecrated a bishop in the old rite in 1972.
Again, this bishop that we're not naming at the moment, retired bishop from Texas who's 97 years old, believed that Pope Benedict was the Pope and not Pope Francis. But now that Pope Benedict died and a fake conclave was held by a few random people in Rome, it seems that he's being purported to maintain that Pope Francis is the Pope now.
Prior to this event at Mel's Ranch, various notable canceled priests had been quietly approached either by Gibson or an associate of his and asked, "Are you satisfied your ordination was valid?" Or a very similar question.
Various canceled priests, which I'm aware of who they are. So is Voris. Again, not going to mention who they are at the moment. Hopefully they'll come forward and they'll kind of explain their side of the story and say what it is and what it wasn't and stuff like that. So, but this is partly one of the reasons why I avoid trying to make celebrities of some priests, and some of the priests that people have turned into celebrities, they might want to start questioning.
Very similar question. Depending on the answer, these priests were led into a sacramental morass with the arrival of 6 priests in Gibson's private chapel in January 2021. There, the retired bishop went through with these priests a, quote, supplying of services ceremony.
Some really interesting pictures out there of various priests who were brought out to Mel Gibson's place in 2021. Just throwing that one out there.
It involved certain parts from the old rite of ordination that had been removed after Vatican II being said over these priests. On its face, this ceremony appears pretty innocuous. However, it is, and here's the point, totally foreign to the church's understanding of the sacrament of holy orders. Why do it if you don't question the liturgical reforms of Vatican II or doubt the reformed rite of ordination?
And, some people might say, well, the reason why is because I get more grace from this other thing. Maybe I'm still validly ordained, but I get more grace. That could potentially be the response that they might offer. I don't know. Perhaps these individuals will come forward and they can offer their explanation, their perception of the events, what did happen, what didn't happen. I'd love to hear more about it. So I'm not making any accusations. I'm not jumping to any conclusions on what their intentions were. We'll see. I mean, hopefully they'll come forward and tell us. And if they didn't do anything wrong, they should be able to come forward and tell us, right? 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 Right.
Given the context of Gibson's sedevacantist views, that it was done at his sedevacantist chapel with an elderly bishop who seems to believe Francis isn't the Pope, the ceremony is at least highly suspect. It gives the impression that these priest ordinations were somehow deficient, but have now been corrected. A similar ceremony was held a second time later in 2021 with other priests. Church Militant knows the identity of several of these priests, but we are withholding them for the moment, as we expect this story will have larger ramifications with their bishops, not to mention the retired bishop who was involved. One or more may regret their actions, for example, and wish to recant. It's not entirely clear if each of the individual priests actually understood what they had submitted to, whether their original ordinations were somehow defective. Church Militant has direct knowledge of some individuals, and we have spoken with some of them who have alerted the hierarchy. Rome is also aware of what happened at Gibson's Ranch, as are at least two of those priests' diocesan bishops. Whatever backroom and canon law issues may be at play, it is possible that this supplying of services ceremony is now at play in their cases before Rome, and may be the reason some of them might be kicked out of the priesthood.
Let's hope it doesn't come to that. Let's hope they come out, explain, hey, here's what I did, here's what I understood it to be. Maybe they have some exculpating information that we haven't considered. I think that would be helpful. That's certainly a possibility. But it doesn't look good when you're going to set of contest chapel without the permission of your bishop in secret, and you're going through some kind of prayer service or ceremony with somebody who denies that Pope Francis is the Pope. I'm just throwing that one out there. Just saying.
To question or instill doubt about the validity of one's own ordination because it was done after 1958 is a grave matter. The church simply cannot have priests walking around doubting the validity of their own ordinations.
And they may not. It could be that they recognize that they're validly ordained, but they just think they're deprived of certain graces.
So much so that they would participate in some kind of ceremony or ritual manipulated by a sedevacantist celebrity. This story is not merely about the sacramental validity of individual ordinations, but of questioning the church's right of ordination itself. This kind of stuff is not terribly unlike what the schismatic SSPX group does in many cases when a priest comes to them and wants to join up. They conditionally ordain him into the schismatic society under the guise of being just sure, just in case your ordination wasn't valid.
And it sounds like this ceremony that they went through wasn't a conditional ceremony. It wasn't a conditional ordination. It's what it sounds like. It sounds like a little bit more nuanced than that. But I don't know, since they won't come forward and tell us just yet. But maybe they will. We'll see.
Suffice it to say, this is the root of schism, its evil consequences and bad fruit, that the sacraments themselves, not just whether they are licit, but doubting then whether they're even valid.
So, you're welcome to certainly go and check out the Vortex. I'll put a link in the show notes for you to go and watch the rest of the video, but that kind of gives you the gist of it. My concern here again is, if there's nothing wrong here, why does this have to be done in secret? Why does it be done at a set of contest chapel? And then why do you have to get somebody who doesn't believe Pope Francis is the Pope to even go through this prayer meeting, whatever it was? It just sounds very questionable. Maybe there could be information out there that we haven't considered that makes it completely legitimate. Perhaps. I'm certainly open to that. But unless people come forward and say, hey, here's what it was and here's what it wasn't, it looks really bad. It looks very concerning. It looks very troubling. So again, some of the canceled priests that people have praised and turned into heroes, you might want to start questioning some of that, as I've been saying for a while now. Now I also want to say there are some people who feel like, oh, this is wrong. Why do you have to go and bring this up and criticize this kind of stuff and expose this kind of stuff? Well, actually, I mean, Boris, as you saw, has more information on this and hasn't given all of it yet. So he's clearly giving people an opportunity to, recant some of this stuff or maybe come forward with an explanation that, again, justifies all of this. So it's not about just exposing somebody or anything like that. That's not the purpose. But again, for those who say, look, the church has been through enough and traditionalists have been through enough, why go and bring this up? That's just going to bring more judgment against the traditionalist movement. You know what that sounds like to me, honestly? It sounds like those who would say, you know what, maybe we should just cover up the fact that this priest did something wrong with a minor or person of the same sex who's not a minor. Maybe we should just cover that up. Maybe we should just not say anything about it. Upon what basis can you criticize those who would hide those kinds of acts but not criticize this? Upon what basis do you want this to be hidden, but this other thing, no, it shouldn't be hidden? They're both sins. If the information is accurate on these things, they're both sins. So upon what basis should one be hidden and covered up, but not the other? Again, unless somebody can come forward and say, hey, no. There was nothing wrong done here. Here's what was happening. Here's, perfectly justifiable, blah, 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 blah. It'd be great. Again, if nothing was done wrong, they shouldn't have a problem with coming forward and telling us what happened, right? Just saying. Okay, well, that is all I had for y'all today. Like I said, I'll put a link in the show notes for the Supplied Grace Ceremony video that we did about a year and a half ago, where we already knew about this, but just couldn't give you any more details about it. So we just talked about it in general. And I'll also put a link to the Vortex one in there. Let's pray for a good outcome to this situation, that schism doesn't continue the church, that people do the right thing and don't continue to divide the body of Christ. All right, that's going to do it, y'all. See y'all later. Take care. God bless.
Are you confused about how Catholic teaching authority works? With encyclicals, papal bulls, councils, and many other things, it's easy to get confused on what is authoritative and what is not. Fortunately, at MaximusInstitute.com, I have prepared a course explaining the magisterium from A to Z. Visit the website and check out the course Understanding the Magisterium for more information. If you're looking to buy or sell a home, office, or any kind of property anywhere in the world, you're going to want to call Real Estate for Life, and they're going to connect you with a Catholic agent. Now, that agent will donate a portion of their commission upon sale, and Real Estate for Life will donate 75% of that gift to a pro-life organization at no cost to you. Call Real Estate for Life at 1-877-LIFE-US1 or text them 248-431-1440. If you care about the pro-life cause, call them now.
Hey, thanks for watching. Don't forget to hit the like button and the subscribe button. God bless.